may go ahead and speak without this. Let me just experiment for a second. Can you still hear me now in the back of the room? All right, I'm going to go without the mic, I think. If I'm not speaking loud enough, please raise your hand. Can you all see this chalkboard? Put it out. I'm not much of an artist. That's a very rudimentary map of Germany. You may or not have recognized it. I'll be referring to that later in the speech. Well, you're probably all familiar with the fact that this is the red letter year. It's the 300th anniversary of Germans in America, the 500th anniversary of the birth of Martin Luther, and during the period 1982 to 84, we're celebrating the 300th anniversary of the founding of Maryland. So certainly we're in an anniversary period. Our motivation must be great, therefore, in this year of all years, to discover more about our German ancestors. When I use the word discover, I do not mean that we will take a romantic trip on a Rhine steamer to gaze out across the water at the castles and vineyards our illustrious ancestors once owned. Nor will we amble into the immense libraries of Munich or Berlin and browse in dusty old tomes about all the wonderful accomplishments of our old European ancestors. Not usual. For our German-speaking ancestors were, on the whole, average people who lived average lives and seldom made any who's who in the old country. They were hard workers, to be sure, but they were human. They suffered the same flaws of character we suffer today. Some couldn't handle finances and left Germany to escape their creditors. Some couldn't handle drink too well. I'd be shocked to find this out, but there were a few there who did enjoy the bottle, and they left the social stigma behind to try to make a new start in this country. Sometimes the community even financed their passage to this country. There are records of this sort in the archives of it. Or they couldn't handle drive very well, and often left illegitimate children and angry families behind in Germany. Or they were the mothers of illegitimate children, and they left the old country to escape social stigma, come here and start a new life. This happened much more often than our Victorian ancestors would like us to know. 25% of all children born in late 19th century Bavaria were born illegitimate. It's 1 in 4. And sometimes illegitimacy even ran a few generations in the family. For a couple of my clients, I found a certain ancestor in Germany who had come here already bearing a child, unmarried, went back and found the family in that town. She was the daughter of a woman who was also not married, and perhaps even one more generation before you finally got into finding out who the paternal ancestor was in a subsequent generation. In some cases, the church books just don't say, father unknown, or father was a soldier passing through. Makes it easier for your chart. Well, don't have to worry about those directions. But to the matter at hand. 300 years of Germans is a slight misnomer, in that there were Germans in America before 1683. 1683 was the first major group of people who came into Philadelphia, settling in Germantown under Pastorius. But there were Germans, mostly from the lowlands of northern Germany, who were involved in trade with the Dutch. and actually spoke a dialect very close to Dutch. They spoke Plattdeutsch, which is Low Dutch, or as the Low Dutch call it, Plattdeutsch, as you may have heard it spoken, and could understand the Dutch. And some of these settled in New Amsterdam, which of course is New York. At least one of these German speakers, who wasn't from the lowlands, but was actually from Prague, in Böhmen or Bohemia, was Augustin Hermann. Although he was from Prague, he was a German speaker from Bohemia, part of the old German culture of that area, and may therefore be considered as part of the German immigration. His immigration is well documented. He was a cartographer, he was a Renaissance man, and I'm sure most of you have seen articles about Augustin Hermann, who settled in Cecil County, Maryland, after first residing in New York. But what about others who may have arrived here before the famous first Palatine arrival in 1709 and the group of 1683? Their number is perhaps small compared with the later hordes of Pfälzer, or Palatines, but they need to be documented, and their descendants are not few. One such person is Hermann Könke, who appears in Wilmington, Delaware, 1702, and then moves to Cecil County by 1717. He naturalized with his family in 1720 in Maryland as Herman Kinke, a Dutchman. Why do I say he was Deutsch and not Dutch? Because he signed a deed in Wilmington, Delaware as Hermann Könke. K-O-umlaut-N-K-E. Germans were the only ones using the umlaut. Therefore he was Deutsch, not Dutch. It's also in the script, the old script signature. But the signature, of course, is from a recorded deed. Therefore, it's a clerk's attempt at copying the signature and not the original deed, but still. You may know, I don't know if there's anyone here who might be related to the family which is now known as Kankey mostly, but you may have heard of Herman Husband, who was related to this man. What sources in Maryland document these earliest Germans? For those not as prominent as Augustin Hermann, we have only the early naturalization records, such as in Bacon's Laws, and we have signatures and documents, as in this case. There were no early Lutheran churches prior to around 1720, whose records have survived, which can tell us much. These early immigrants are recorded in Episcopal churches of Maryland at all. You'll find Herman Kinke and his descendants in the Episcopal church in Cecil County. Unfortunately, we have just raw data, and I don't think you have any death record for Herman giving his exact age, so that's up to guessing as to how old he was. German immigration into Maryland picks up by the 1720s. A careful scanning of Prince George's County land records, for example, would reveal many German surnames, starting with that period. Some early groups were the group that came in with Thomas Schley. There were also many early Swiss, such as the Staley family, by 1740. Also, Jeffrey Wyand's book of Colonial Maryland Naturalizations provide a picture of the increasing number of Germans. But don't ask for the original naturalization record for those listed in Wyand, expecting to find therein, in plain black and white, the village of origin of your ancestors. Do I have to explain that, or do all of you understand why and why not? The early naturalization records, the man went forward and he swore an oath of allegiance. That was all. So you have his name, the fact that he may be sworn or took communion with a Lutheran or Reformed pastor, but as far as a place of origin or age or description. That's not to be found. Also, I would wager that not even half of the German immigrants who came into colonial Maryland are recorded in Wyoming, for one reason or another. Some of them signed a sworn oath of allegiance in Philadelphia and considered that was enough after arriving in Maryland. Some were tenant farmers. Perhaps they never needed to assume title to a piece of property and therefore didn't naturalize for that reason. What are some other sources? Ship's passenger lists. If you consider that many of those who settled in Maryland arrived via Philadelphia before 1800, then yes. What do these lists tell us? Referring to the well-known publication, which I call Straßburger Hinky, but which has, I think the full title is Pennsylvania German Pioneers. It was first published in Norristown, Pennsylvania in 1934, and has been reprinted by the Genealogical Publishing Company recently. The only problem with the reprint edition is that it's in 2 volumes and not in 3. And I'll explain that now. From the 3-volume set, Volume 2 being a publication of the facsimiles of the original lists, you can find out such things as whether the person could or couldn't write, whether he made his X on the list, or whether he could spell his name and how he spelled it, because that may be the criterion you will be using in making inquiries in Germany. One family I worked on recently was the family of Wegerlein, settled in Lancaster County. They eventually became Weigley in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. So if you're working with Weigley, you'd not get very far, I'm afraid, by writing in German. You need to know that it was Wegerlein, as he spelled it. Some lists will say that the boatload came from Zweibrücken, Trier, and the Alsace. Or some similar description, maybe a boatload of people from Switzerland. Majority of these will only be titled Palatines, which means little or nothing. The reason being that the first boatload in 1709 were Chotza, or Palatines, and probably half of the people who came to this country in that period were Palatines, in other words, from the area right here, being the Palatinate. This is the Rhine River for your orientation coming out of Switzerland. It forms the border on the west with Germany, and where it makes the elbow and goes north, this little area right in here roughly is Palatinate. Largely destroyed by wars between the Germans and the French. A lot of people left because there was nothing to keep them in the old country. Unfortunately, because of the number of people who came from the Palatinate, Americans would say, well, there comes another boatload of Chotza. Unfortunately, a lot of the people who were arriving weren't from the Palatinate at all, but they were just grouped together. We might say that today we might say, well, there's another group of Czechoslovakians. What you really have is 3 separate provinces of Moravia and the other 2 provinces, Slavonia. And so we had a similar problem there. People were arriving from the Alsace, the area west of the Rhine, which is now in France. People were arriving from Hesse. People were arriving even from Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg. So, as I say, Palatine or Chotza often doesn't mean very much. If you can't, the lists have one other value that we find in Straßburger Hinky. If you cannot find your immigrant ancestors' place of origin in any sources, as I will go into below, then you may wish to try the fellow traveler technique. That is, on a given ship's list, you might find your ancestor, and then above and below his name will be, of course, any other names. You may not find a place of origin for your ancestor, but you might want to check into finding places of origin in American sources for the people who appear above and below, because people often immigrated in groups. I was recently working on the Bartmus family, settled in York County and later moved on to western Pennsylvania. And in checking the records in Germany and comparing the ships lists in Philadelphia in the 1750s and 1740s, next to Bartmus, I find all of the other names that were typical in that village, up to maybe 14 or 15, not only in that period, but then you find another typical name, say 1738, and you find another group of 10 or 15 surrounding that are very typical in that area. So the fellow traveler technique is important to keep in mind. We also have church records, and I'm speaking specifically of Maryland here. The talk was entitled Church Records in Germans in Maryland. All right. If you do not find a place of origin recorded in the church, you may find at least some specific data on your ancestors, such as date of death, date of marriage, or if they arrived here already married, you find the name of the maiden name of the wife. This is all important. The more names that you can cluster together around the name of your ancestor as perhaps arriving together, the more chance there is of finding place of origin in Germany. The two churches that I know of in all the state of Maryland that mention place of origin before 1800, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, which has been very well transcribed. The death records are the most important here. Very well transcribed by Reverend Weiser, Frederick S. Weiser of Hanover, Pennsylvania. That was published a few years ago, covering the period 1743 to 1811. The death records often go into great detail, as a matter of fact. One of the records mentions the fact that the man had been very prominent in the community, but in late life he had turned to old devil rum, and his health had failed after that. But he left quite a progeny. He would certainly be proud of his place in the community. The other is the First German Reformed Church of Baltimore. It mentions places of origin up through, in the death records, up through, I think it's about 1818. There's one problem with this set of records. The church went through various mergers, and the church is now First and St. Stephen's United Church of Christ out on York Road in Baltimore. And the originals of the First Reformed Church have been shipped off to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to the archives of the Evangelical and Reformed Historical Society, across from Franklin and Marshall. People have made attempts at transcribing these records and publishing them, transcribing and translating. And I have not found an adequate translation yet. I've examined the originals, and the transcriptions and translations fall short of the mark, unfortunately. So it's again back to the originals, or ad fontes, and back to the sources. In connection with that, I'd mentioned that there are a number of other records of the Reformed Church in Maryland which have been shipped off to Lancaster. I'm a little bit upset about this because if they're Maryland records, they should be in Maryland. And I've been trying to get the Hall of Records to get someone to film the records that are in Lancaster, but without much success yet. Lancaster came out with a book, Church and Pastoral Records, published by the Evangelical and Reformed Historical Society. And it lists in here the records that they have for the city of Baltimore and for the other congregations in Maryland. Unfortunately, I find some errors in the bibliography. I know they have original records from 1768 to 1870, but they don't mention that they have originals beyond 1813.
Could you give us the address for that book right now?
The address? Well, maybe you can look at it after. Evangelical and Reformed Historical Society, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I know how to get there with my car, but I can't give you an address. Good. There's also, for Lutheran records in Maryland, Fred Weiser, Reverend Weiser, has also published a bibliography of Lutheran records before 1800. He's published it in 30 different places, but the one I use is in the report, the Journal of German American History, published by the Society of History of Germans in Maryland, report number 38. That's their most recent report. It's a valuable source, not only because it has his bibliography in it, it also has a bibliography of German church records in Virginia and West Virginia, the German-speaking settlers in Georgia that George Bentley Jones has put together, and a number of lists of German arrivals in the port of Baltimore, which appear in no other place. These are taken from newspapers and supplement the lists that are on film. So this is well worth the investment. And if you want to know how to obtain it, I can tell you that. So that's for the Lutherans and the Reformed. There's one other church that might have some places of origin. If your ancestor was Moravian and settled in Maryland, there's the Graceham Moravian Church. It's one large Moravian congregation in the state of Maryland. And their records, the Moravians believed in personal biography, and often you have a great deal of information in Moravian records. Many of them felt called to sit down before they passed on and wrote a long autobiography. Exactly when they came over, the name of the boat, how many children they brought over, everything, the place they came from. You might want to check the Moravian records for the Church of Graceham. Those are available in transcription. There's also a photostat of the original at the Maryland Historical Society. Also, next to it on the shelf at the Historical Society. Tombstone inscriptions are also very handy. And the most well-known guide to Maryland, early Maryland German tombstone inscriptions is Jacob Merling Holdcraft's Names in Stone, which appeared in 2 volumes in 1966, published by Ann Arbor. There's a small supplement which you don't want to overlook. It easily gets lost on shelves. You find the 2 large volumes, but the little thin volume sometimes falls down behind, or it's the same color binding, at least in our Historic Society library. One of the most notable early inscriptions out in Frederick County is for the Thomas family. You can still read on the stone, Schieferstadt, Pfalz. They were among the earliest of settlers in Frederick County. And that's Wilmette, Maryland. South of Frederick, where they went to church, there's a little graveyard, and in the graveyard is the stone that still says Schieferstadt. And Schieferstadt is right in there. It's one of the large group of actual Pfälzer, not one of those that was called Pfälzer and really wasn't. Newspaper notices in, I mention only Merlin Goldcroft because he is the one who has done the most thorough job of collecting tombstone inscriptions. There are various other sources, but there are none so complete and put together as Holdcraft's. You have the DAR has done some work on tombstone inscriptions. We have to find the county and see if they've done that cemetery, or just take a look. But that is more in the 19th century. I'll get to in a minute. Newspaper notices in 18th century Maryland are of little assistance in determining place of origin for the German immigrants. In Pennsylvania, on the other hand, we have Edward Hocker's volume of gleanings from early German language newspapers of that state. These include a few references to Conococheague and Monocacy, which of course are places in Maryland, Conococheague being in Washington County, Monocacy in Frederick County. What you sometimes found in these early papers was a notice such as Georg Braun of Baden-Durlach, seeking sister who came to America 7 years ago, now living at Miller's Tannery at Crossroads. This, of course, is very valuable. We finally found out that Browns came from Baden-Durlach. And maybe there's somehow a connection to Maryland because they eventually moved down there later. This volume by Hocker has been, it was originally a typescript and only available in the library in Philadelphia, has now been published by GPC. GPC is Genealogical Publishing Company in Baltimore. There are also local histories sometimes contain a place of origins. Scarf's or Sharp's History of Western Maryland talks about various prominent settlers and will often mention they came in such and such a year and where they were from in Germany, and that's always a big help. The history by T.J.C. Williams, 2 volumes of Frederick County, also mentions places of origin, and there's a comparable volume from Washington County. Unfortunately, the volumes by Williams are not nearly as reliable as the one by Starr. There are also now a number of published sources containing information on German immigrants of the 18th century. The most complete key to these materials is a 3-volume set entitled Passenger Immigration List Index, which probably most of you have seen. It's published by Gale Research in 1981. There's a companion volume, Passenger and Immigration List Bibliography, which is an update of the old Lancour bibliography of ships' lists and covers the period of 1538 to 1900, roughly. The first set of 3 volumes, which was published in 1981, contains roughly 600,000 names of immigrants from the late 1500s to around 1900. A supplement containing another 200,000 names has already gone to the press. Didn't see it. Thank you. Good. I'll be the first. I'll beat you all back to the table. This index will key you to many articles and books which were published in Germany. Over the years, many local historians in Germany wrote about citizens who left their villages to go to America. Archives published books about them because of the sheer numbers. Historically interesting. We have, I was the person processing all the German materials for Gale Research for these volumes. And we tried to obtain as many of the printed articles and books as possible. And we treat them as passenger lists, even though they're basically telling you that so-and-so left in 1749 to go to America. We're saying, well, that's almost as good as that he arrived in 1749 in this country. So all those articles were treated as lists of arrivals. We're also trying to keep abreast of new publications as they appear. For example, a volume recently appeared containing the names of thousands of Germans who emigrated from the Duchy of Lippe-Detmold. This volume here. Die Auswanderer aus dem Fürstentum Lippe bis 1877. They used printed sources in newspapers, archival sources, and came up with 9 or 10 different categories. Some of these people left as early as the 1700s, but most of them did not go to America in that period. They went to get involved in trade in Holland, places like that. Lippe is an area up here in central, what was later known as the Kingdom of Hanover. A lot of the people from Lippe Detmold went to settle in the Midwest, Illinois, Iowa, but there were probably also a few who stopped off and stayed in Maryland. Another printed source is Hetrina. It's in 5 volumes. It's Hetrina. This contains a list of Hessian soldiers who served in America during the Revolutionary War, and indications in these lists. This was done by computer, process, put it all on computer, and printed these volumes in the Hessian State Archives in Marburg. There are notations in the columns of soldiers who deserted or were discharged in America following the Revolution. There were also some soldiers who were recorded as fatalities. That's a number 7, died of wounds. But they were recorded as fatalities because too many deserters wouldn't have looked good on the rolls. So if you find a man that looks like your ancestor in Hetrina and it says died of wounds, don't believe it. I had one of those, so I know what I'm talking about. There were other contingents of soldiers serving during the Revolution as well. The Ansbach-Bayreuth troops, who came from northern Bavaria. The Brunswickers, or Braunschweiger, as the German word is. We don't like to use that word because it reminds us of the sausage we spread on. But several articles have been published on these troops, the Ansbach-Bayreuth and the Braunschweiger, and they have been included and indexed in the PILI. The Passenger Immigration List Index I will from now on refer to as PILI. Most of these articles were authored by Clifford Neal Smith, who has put it on a number of sources on Germans in America. If your ancestor suddenly appeared during or immediately after the American Revolution, consider the possibility that he arrived on a troop ship. Family sources. This is almost in reverse. I should have started with this one. Family sources, old documents, family Bibles, diaries. Perhaps they've even been stored in a local historic society. Perhaps you belong to the branch that went west. The local branch where they first settled died out, and the last maiden aunt, before she died, deposited that diary of 1784 in the local historical society. It's worth it to go check the local historical society, or even trace all those other branches of the family. The one that settled in Madison, Wisconsin, he still had the diary of 1784. He was put in the library in Madison. All right, we're going to go now. I've been working on the 18th century because it has its own specific problems. We'll now go to the 19th century. What sources can we turn to on this side of the Atlantic to ascertain the places of origin of people who arrived in the 19th century? Why do we even want to know their place of origin? Haven't those systematic, efficient Germans alphabetized and centralized all the 19th century immigration records by now? Not really. Take my word for it. Some of the sources which you can consult, again, are the same as the ones considered for 18th century. Family materials. Do not neglect not contacting all branches of the family. The one piece of evidence I found which connected me back to the place of origin of my great-grandfather was a little printed document I found with a second cousin that nobody had seen in years and really cared about. Lived in St. Louis in an apartment. She'd often thought of throwing away that little shoebox with all those old pictures and all those little documents. It was very crucial because my ancestor's name had been Bugai, and he changed it to Meyer. And no one knew that he had done that. Or all they knew was that there had been a name change, and that was it. And this one document showed me that he had actually been forgotten. All right. Also, in addition to the family materials, the similar sources would be the PILI for the 19th as well as the 18th century. Tombstone inscriptions are again a big help in the 19th century as well as the 18th. You still had a lot of Germans coming over here, and on the stone will be carved, born in Bietigheim in the Kods in 1824. That's what you're looking for. Church records. We have a lot more church records to deal with in the 19th century. The Hall of Records in Annapolis, under the able leadership of Phoebe Jacobson, has been attempting to collect a large number of Maryland church records on microfilm. Ultimately, they'd like to have all on microfilm, but they have a slight problem in that the conditions are that the church must bring the records into the Hall of Records, leave them there, come back in 6 weeks or however long, pick them up, take them back to their church. So you have many churches which are saying, we don't have anybody who can take the records down there. And that's such a long drive. Think of the poor people, the poor churches out in Cumberland, for example, in Western Maryland. But they have done quite a job. They have the original records of Zion Lutheran on film. And believe me, you need to see the original records of Zion Lutheran. The old transcriptions are not worth the paper they're printed on, or written on, as far as I'm concerned, because first of all, the old pastor wrote in such a script that you have to study it very carefully and compare it against other knowledge to figure out what the name is he's writing down there. And places, I just almost lose the few hairs I have when I have to work with the transcriptions as I went through. St. Luke's on Henrietta and Sharp, much later church, 1860s, but the originals are on film in the Hall of Records. St. Stephen's and St. James Lutheran, Trinity Lutheran, St. Michael's German Catholic, 14 Holy Martyrs German Catholic. Almost all of the Catholic records of Baltimore City are now on film in the Hall of Records. And this includes a number of Catholic churches which were strictly German parishes. St. James, St. John, St. Michael's, St. Alphonsus, Holy Cross in South Baltimore. Fortunately, the German priests were very thorough in recording data in these records. For a long period, we have every baptism is recorded. The place of origin of both the father and mother is recorded in the baptism record. So, if you have some German Catholic ancestry in Baltimore, consider yourself lucky. The first German congregation in Baltimore was St. John's, started around 1804. The records start in that period. The church started a little earlier. But there are no places of origin given in St. John's until the 1840s. That's when it starts to pick up. My reason for my explanation for this is that the more Germans who came in, the more necessary it was to distinguish between all the Johann Schmidts by saying this was Johann Schmidt of Bietigheim and this was Johann Schmidt of Hessenau. And that's when they began putting down where they all came from. But there are many German church records which are still in possession of local churches and on film. The reasons being, as I gave before, it's just too much trouble for the church to get it down to the archives. And then there are also several church records which have been shipped off to places like Lancaster. There's one church in Baltimore. They're a member of the Missouri Synod. Said, well, our records were filmed by the Missouri Synod, and we sent the film off to St. Louis, and why you don't need to come see our records because the films are in St. Louis. Well, that doesn't do you much good. You can, I think, I may end up buying that film and donating it to society. It's too far to go to St. Louis. Do not forget that as the hordes of immigrants began coming into Maryland in the 1840s, traditionally non-German faiths began establishing German-speaking congregations to win over these new souls. In Baltimore, we find in the 1800s German Methodist congregations. There was a big German Methodist congregation on Light Street. South Baltimore. There was a German Baptist congregation. I have yet to find the records of this church, but the pastor's name was Moiri. That was in the 1840s and 50s, probably Swiss. There was also a sect called the Evangelical Association. It was founded, at least the first church of that sect was founded in Baltimore in 1840. It was later called Emmanuel Church and located on Green Street and Cider Alley. The several congregations were all German-speaking. In beliefs, they were probably pretty close to the Methodists. The descendants of this sect have merged with the Methodists and are now part of the United Methodist Church. Therefore, if you have any idea they might have been in the Evangelical Association, you might want to look into the archives of the United Methodist Church in Lovely Lane Museum on St. Paul Street in Baltimore. And do not forget the United Brethren, whose founding father was the Reformed pastor Philip Otterbein. Their first church, now known commonly as the Otterbein Church, was founded in the 1770s, but sat on a rise near the harbor in South Baltimore and served as a beacon to all the German immigrants who were arriving throughout the 19th century. Many stopped in the neighborhood of Otterbein and stayed there, and their vital statistics are recorded in the church, in the records of that church. The most commonly accessible source for those records is a multifaxed typescript, which was put together by one of the late pastors of the church, and I have not compared it with the original to see how close he is. There are some places of origin given in death records for that church also, not as much as with other churches. Ships lists. For Baltimore, we have the city lists, which cover the period 1833 to 1866. We have the federal lists, which cover the period 1820 to 1897. They didn't stop arriving in those in 1897. The other lists are also available, but most of the people who are doing genealogy, I find, are the ones who had ancestors arriving before 1900. There are a small number they're just second, third generation already. They don't know where they came from, but most it's before 1900. I believe the films from 1897 to 1942 were just recently donated to the Historical Society. Well, that's the National Archives for you. All right, there was also, in addition to these two sets of lists, the Gulf and Atlantic Coast abstracts. These are on film in the National Archives and supposedly cover the period 1820 to 1874. The interesting thing about these lists is that they were abstracts prepared in the year the person arrived, in the quarter. They were quarterly abstracts prepared by the master of the port, Baltimore, and sent to the Secretary of State in that quarter, at the end of each quarter. Those lists were more well preserved than the original lists, which sat in various places in cartons and so forth until the 1940s, when they were then filmed. So you have a more complete set of arrivals in these abstracts. GPC became aware of this and has now recently published a first portion of these abstracts, 1820 to 1834. It's only been out about a month, I think. The disadvantage with the abstract is that you often do not have even a place of origin. You might say Germany. That's all. That's not much help. It's strange. You'll find a whole group of names in the abstract. There'll be all the ages given. Group like the family, Germany. The next set just have names, no ages. So by that way, you can tell which shipload was which, because that was certainly one shipload with the names in Germany, and the next shipload was the one without the names. The problem with the lists, they call the city lists and the federal lists, is that Other sources now coming to light are showing us that there were actual errors when the filming of these lists took place. All right, imagine what happened. These lists have been sitting in archives or in boxes with no temperature regulation, no humidity regulation for 100 years. The filmers come in. They pick up these bundled documents. They start unfolding. The paper cracks, or it's already in pieces. They find loose pieces of roll of film. Wilhelmina, May 12, 1854. Not there. What happened? Well, there were 2 arrivals of the Wilhelmina in 1854. Of course, the ship unloaded, went back to Germany, no load passengers, came back again. Both lists are published in this volume. What had happened when they filmed it? They took the list, the title page from the first Wilhelmina, and put it with the list of the second Wilhelmina arrival. So those sorts of transpositions were also taking place. There were a lot of Germans who arrived in other ports, of course, and came to Baltimore for various reasons. They might have had a distant relative here they were coming to see. They liked what they saw and stayed here. A lot of them hopped the first boat they could get in the old country. And they knew that they were going to Baltimore, so even if they landed in New York, they could find their way. I should mention here, my own ancestor who changed his name. There were letters which survived, which he had written back to Germany 25 years after arriving in this country. And he described his whole trip. He was in Le Havre in France. A lot of southern Germans went this way, came over here, and took the boat from Le Havre, France, to come to America. They didn't go from Hamburg and Bremen to the northern ports. It was cheaper to go out the west. He changed his mind at the very last minute. Instead of taking the boat from New York, which he had said he was going to take in a letter he wrote from Le Havre, he took another boat which went to New Orleans. When he got to New Orleans, he found he was penniless, decided he'd heard the gold rush had just broken out, decided he'd go to California. He took another little skiff over to the Mexican coast, went across the Mexican highlands. This is the way he describes it. He didn't go down to Panama. Got some kind of other boat, went up to California, was so scared by the horrors of the gold rush, that he then took another boat, somehow arrived back in New York, went by foot from New York to Philadelphia to Baltimore to Cumberland, where he then married a local Maryland lady. So you can see the problems you're running into when you're trying to find somebody in the ship's list. Another ancestor of a client of mine, I looked in all these places trying to find the arrival. He arrived in Nova Scotia and probably caught a local coastal boat. As I say, they hopped the nearest boat to get over here and ended up, as long as they were in North America, it was fine. You could walk the rest of the way. The Philadelphia list covered the period 1800 to 1897. They're on film in the National Archives. Unfortunately, it's an alphabetical index versus a soundex for the Baltimore lists. And if you've done any work with alphabetical list versus soundex, you know what you're running into when you have an alphabetical index. The 1800 date is a little misleading in that the lists covering the period 1800-1820 are roughly cargo manifests. One of the Dom family out in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, there's a mention of a Philip Dom sending the parcel to himself in Philadelphia. And that's all the mention we have. No age, no place of origin. Fortunately, we were able to find place of origin in other sources. After 1820, you start picking up with actual descriptions of people and places of origin. New York is a genealogist's nightmare if your ancestor arrived after 1846. The lists are alphabetically indexed from 1820 to 1846. But after that period, there were hundreds of thousands of immigrants coming into the port of New York. And it's a lifetime job to try to pick your ancestor out of all those lists. Considering also the possibility that how many lists were actually lost before they started filming in the 1940s. I believe there's a project we'll be starting up shortly to try to go through some 5 million names of immigrants who came through New York. And perhaps in the next decade we will see these names published. So that will help. Newspapers. Generally, we check newspapers for obituaries. You do that if you even have Anglo-American or Irish-American or other ethnic ancestors. We find that unless they were terribly prominent, they warranted little more than a brief mention until around 1865 or 1870. It came in vogue to write a little more about the person who passed on in that period. The same was true in the German language newspapers of the day. They were published in Baltimore, Washington, Hagerstown, Frederick, Cumberland. Unfortunately, the only ones that I'm aware of that exist for any period are the ones in Baltimore, Washington, and a 5-year stretch in the city of Cumberland, Maryland, 1891 to 1896, which is still available in the original.
Where is that?
That's at the Enid Pratt Library. It's very brittle, and they may not let you look at it.
Is that on microfilm?
No. They have a project. They keep telling me they're going to get it on film, they're going to get it on film, but they haven't gotten it on film. And it's, I don't know, you learn patience in this work. I'm sure you all know that.
And frustration.
Yes. All right, Baltimore, there are 3 papers which still exist. Der Wecker, which covers the period 1853 to 1872. That's only an original, also at the Pratt Library. There are a few gaps there. That's not a complete run from 1853 to 73. The Deutsche Korrespondent was the longest running paper. It was founded in 1844, ran until 1918 when anti-German sentiment from the First World War put an end to its
Spell these
publication.
words, please. How do you spell their Wecker?
W-E-C-K-E-R. Means the person who wakes somebody up. Which is also an expression, fällt mir auf den Wecker. I mean, he's getting on my nerves. And a Wecker is also an alarm clock. Okay, the Deutsche Korrespondent is still available in an almost complete run from 1870 to 1918. That's on film at the Library of Congress in the periodicals room. There's a less complete run, an original, in a couple of different repositories in Baltimore. There's also a paper that came up called the Baltimore Journal. If you look at it and you don't know it's a German paper, you'd say Baltimore Journal. But it's the Baltimore Journal, and that was from the period 1887 to 1913. That's also only an original, and that's at the Pratt. Again, I must caution the newspapers had, toward the end of the century, not only newspapers but also books, had a very high acid content. And the papers are literally going to dust on the shelves. And if you're not very careful, you'll end up with a handful of nothing to try to deal with it. Washington also had a large influx of Germans. D.C., that's sort of Maryland, so I'll mention it briefly. A large number of Germans came into Washington around 1830. They advertised apparently for laborers to build Pennsylvania Avenue. And there were a large number of German stonemasons and other skilled tradesmen, carpenters and so forth, who started coming in at that period. Churches developed to answer the need of the Lutheran Reformed churches that are still, the descendant churches are still around. But they had a paper called the Columbia, which was a German paper that's available for the mid-1870s in original at the Library of Congress periodicals room. And then the Washington Journal. Again, if you look at it, it says Washington Journal. But it's the Washington Journal, and that was succeeded the Columbia paper, and is, I believe, has been published continuously, even in spite of World War I and World War II. And you can still subscribe to it today if you wish. It has all the local news on German social activities, mostly social activities. I will say this about the Washington Journal. I have been disappointed in the obituary material that I've tried to find there in the 1890s, 1900s. They just didn't go into that sort of thing, or it's not nearly as extensive as what appeared in the correspondent. And interestingly enough, the connections between Baltimore and Washington have always been pretty strong. And in the Deutsche Korrespondent, there was always a little column called Lokalberichte aus Washington, local news from Washington. And in that, you would often find mention of so-and-so deceased in Washington, a prominent German immigrant. Don't forget that they often had relatives between the two cities also. Concerning the Washington newspapers, you might want to look at volume 30 of this same periodical, which you can still order. We have a backlog on the executive board of this society, and we have a back boxes of old reports that we're still selling. And volume 30 has an article by Klaus Wust, a bibliography of German language newspapers of Washington, D.C. And it also has a little informative bit of history in the front portion of the article about the Germans. Census. If nothing else, try the census. If your ancestor arrived after 1850, or shortly before 1850, you might find some sort of information in the census. Now, I find that in the 1850 and the 1900 census, the most frequent place listed is Germany, which isn't much help. The 1860, 70, and 80 censuses, the immigrants were still saying, I was from Bavaria, I was from Hesse. They considered themselves a Hessian and a Bavarian first, and a German second. By 1900, Bismarck had been and gone, Kaiser Wilhelm was here, and it was Germany, also called the North German Confederation. So in some of these census records, particularly, well, place of origin of the person himself, you might find Hesse. But in 1880, of course, you have places of origin for both parents, which is also good. Find out if he came over, where his parents met here, or they met somewhere else. You find in the 1880 census that his father was born in Hesse and his mother was born in Oldenburg. There's little chance that they met over there and then came over here. There are exceptions. All right, so now you've gone through all the sources that you can possibly think of in this country. And all you know is Hesse. All right, I'm going to take two extreme examples now. First case history here. You found all the right kinds of information in church records, newspaper obituaries, ship's lists, and you now know that Gottfried Clement was born 16 August 1826 in Auenhagen and came to America in 1852, where he met Louise Müller of Rodesgrün, and they had 8 children. You also know that both Gottfried and Louise have been strictly Lutheran ever since they arrived in America. Congratulations. You're in that very select group of people tracing genealogy, upon whom the goddess of great fortune has smiled most dazzlingly. The next step is to identify this Auenhagen. You'd like to know the zip code if you're going to write to Auenhagen. Yes, the Germans have zip codes called the Postleitzahl. And you want to make sure that there was only one Auenhagen. I had a client came to me and said, well, I've been doing my groundwork. German records, German Catholics in Baltimore, very conscientious. Every time the baptism of a child, the father's place of origin was given as Röthenbach. So I know Röthenbach, and we're all set. It was Bavaria. I knew that too. So I sat down with my German atlas, found that there were 30 Röthenbachs in Bavaria of various spellings. And of course, you can't trust the priest because he writes as he hears it, and Röthenbach spelled. An O umlaut can also sound like an E, as you found out with Künke and Kenke and Kenke. So you have Rettenbach, which could sound the same as a Huttenbach to a priest, depending on where the priest was from. The priest might have been from Oldenburg and he's talking to Bavarian, different dialect. It could have been Ruttenbach with two T's. It could have been Ruttenbach with the TH, because the TH is also just pronounced T. What do? You go back and look at the family some more. You finally found out that a collateral relative, I forget if it was a brother or a brother-in-law, came from a village. You looked up that village, and lo and behold, Ruttenbach in this other village. We identified which Ruttenbach. And then we wrote them all the information we wanted. Well, some of the information we wanted. We didn't want to invest in getting all the information. But he did have a chance to go visit the village later on and was quite pleased. All right, once you've identified the village, you've got the zip code, you can write an inquiry either in English, or you can find someone to write it in German for you. And, all right, in this case we knew that they were Lutheran, so we want to write to the Evangelisches Pfarramt, 3262 Auenhagen, Federal Republic of West Germany. You want to make it brief, to the point. You want to, you know this person, this birth date, came to America in 1852. You want the following three things. No more, just about 2 or 3, and the pastor will say, forget it. I don't have the time. You have pastors over there who are working, one pastor, 4 parishes. They don't have the time for lengthy letters. Sometimes you even get a letter from a retired pastor who happens to be handling the inquiries because the pastor who works the parish doesn't have the time. Then you're lucky because sometimes there isn't a retired pastor to handle it. Okay, it's always good to enclose 2 international reply coupons. Get those at the post office. Perhaps a little cash. Money talks, you know. And you may wish to send it registered return receipt so that you'll have proof that your money was actually received on the other end by the right person. I send all the inquiries for my clients registered return receipt. It's more expensive, but certain. Then you wait. You may wait only a month. You may wait a year. As I say, they're very busy. You may have to write reminder letters. By the way, Reverend Pastor, I did write you 3 months ago, and just checking, make sure that nothing was lost in the mail. Keep it polite. But at least 90% or more of my inquiries have been answered. The reply will usually contain specific answers to your specific questions. And that's all. We're not going to give you the whole history because we don't have time for that. For a full genealogy from these church records, you will probably have to retain a qualified professional to go to the old parish and abstract all the remaining data. But at least you have done one thing. You have verified that your ancestors came from that village. Whether his ancestors have stayed in that village from the beginning of time, that's another matter to find out later. Don't forget that people did move around within Germany, even though your impression, the old impression I always had was they grew up in this little town surrounded by these snow-capped mountains, and they lived there for 1,000 years. And then somebody got itchy and decided to go to America. No, that wasn't the case. Sometimes there were people who were sort of migrant workers themselves in Germany. They moved from town to town, worked farms, and eventually it was just one more move. They took the big move, went to America. All right, let's take the other extreme now. You know only that Johann Dengler, born around 1825 from the census, of course census can be off 3 or 4 years either way, first appears in records in Maryland about 1860. Dies after 1880, before 1900, but you don't know exactly when because you can't find when or where he's buried. Because maybe the certificate, the birth death certificate was filed under Dingler, Dangler, Dungler, something else, and of course the Vital Statistics Office is not going to check all those variant spellings for you, and they're not send letters either. He states consistently Bavaria, his country of origin, on the 1860, 70, and 80 censuses. What are your chances for success? Well, don't get your hopes up. First, you should know that Bavaria in the 19th century described what I call Old Bavaria, between Baden-Württemberg and Austria, this area here, Munich being right, Munich, or München, and an area called the Bayerische Pfalz, or Bavarian Palatinate. The royal houses had gotten together, a few intermarriages, a few little transactions, and all of a sudden the king of Bavaria was also the king of the Palatinate. The Bayerische Pfalz, the old area where the Pfalzer came from, they used to call them, they were not Pfalzer, they were Bavarians all of a sudden. So when your ancestor said Bavaria, you might have been talking about this, or you might have been talking about that, and there's no connection between the two. So, what do you do? All right, one source in Germany that covers both 18th and 19th century immigration for the Palatinate is the Heimatstelle Pfalz. A number of you may have already written there. It's a private organization. I believe it has some government funding. And over the years, the Pfalzer have been particularly interested in where their relatives went because they've been such a scattered group. Pfalzer, because of what happened in the wars and so forth, they scattered all over the world, and those who did remain behind always wanted to know what happened to all those people and when they left and so forth. So they kept a card file. They've got a big card file. It's about as from that door over the wall, about so high, that there's all these cards that they've prepared, and it's 1700s and 1800s Palatines, basically. But of course, 1800s, we're talking Bavarian Palatines. It's not a complete source. There are lots and lots of people who came from those areas that are not in those card files. For example, if your name was Barnheiser, or you have some Barnheiser relatives, Barnheisers are not in there with the place of origin. We think we know where they're from, but nobody's taken the trouble to prove it yet. The Heimatstelle Pfalz? There are several published sources which would give the full address. It's in Kaiserslautern, which many of you may know from having had somebody in the service.
Well, I might mention, that's hard to find, except it's across from the art museum. And there's only one art museum. It's on Benzine Ringstrasse.
Yeah, Benzino
It's across from the art museum. That makes it easy to find.
Yes.
Pardon? Kaiserslautern.
Kaiserslautern. If you have a chance to visit there, you'll be cordially received by Roland Powell and staff, and they'll be very happy to help you. They're very busy. The one small problem with the Heimatstelle is that they are very busy. With the explosion of interest among Americans in German heritage to find out more about their ancestry, their office has been overwhelmed over the last 2 years with inquiries, and you must sometimes wait months for a reply. It's been my experience. Well, let's say that you get a negative reply from the Heimatstelle Pfalz, and you think, well, I'll try, maybe they were from Old Bavaria. All right, then you can write to the Bayerische Landesverein für Familienkunde, the Bavarian State Society for Genealogy. That's in Munich. There's a very nice gentleman there named Hugo Zum, retired technical engineer. We'll be glad to check their card file of immigrants and send you a reply. Let's even send you little photocopies of the individual card, index cards. The card file, however, is based largely on notices which appeared in newspapers in the 19th century of Mittelfranken. Mittelfranken is only one county in Bavaria, roughly in here. This is all Bavaria. You don't have to worry too much about the southern part. There were a few Germans who left the snow-covered mountains that we can associate with Garmisch, but most of them came from the northern regions and the western regions of Bavaria. So if your ancestor came from Middle Franken, you might get a good reply from writing to the information. But if you came from Oberfranken, Unterfranken, Oberpfalz, you might not have as much luck. The articles were placed in the newspapers because it was required by law. The person had to publish the fact that he was leaving so his creditors had a chance to collect all their debts. And I believe he also had to pay a small fee to the government for a tenth of what he was worth.
Was this law only in Bavaria or all of Germany?
There were similar laws in other parts of the German-speaking countries. So they published a little notice in the paper. Oh, this book on Lipidetmold, they had similar notices in papers. That's how they were able to find a lot of those immigrants. But such laws were not passed until the 30s and 40s of the 1800s. The Genealogical Society of Mittelfranken, the headquarters of which is Nuremberg, has been the most active in researching immigration from Bavaria, but only from their area. They also have immigration files, but for the most part, they duplicate what's in Munich. So, probably wasting your time if you got negative from Munich to write to Nuremberg. If none of those sources work out, and you still only know that Johann Dengler was born in roughly 1825 and was born probably in Bavaria, you maybe have to be one of those who does some more digging in this country, or just sit back and wait and hope that someday somebody's going to publish the fact that he left Dingelshausen in 1842. Some local historian might find him. All right, now let's say that you're one of these people who just knows Hesse or one of these other areas, right? You have all these areas in Bavaria, all these areas in Germany. Don't forget that Germany wasn't united as such until 1871. So before that time, a person coming from these areas was primarily a Bavarian, or a Hessian, or a Hanoverian, or a Kauzak, or a Badenser from Baden, the area down along the Rhine. Or he was from Württemberg. Had a band called me recently from San Francisco saying, I found the place of origin. It says in the census Wittenberg. Is that where Luther was born? No, that's Württemberg. It's just poorly written. And so, for each of these places, there's a separate archives. And first you can deal with secular archives, state archives, or you can deal with church archives. For example, in Baden, you have the Karlsruhe, here, the Badisches Generallandesarchiv, which has, again, a sort of card file that the people who've been variously interested in immigration have put this and that little note in there that so-and-so went to America. It's not complete. We don't have every person at Baden who left went to America in their file. We've got some. If you're lucky, you write there and say, Johann Egner came to America in 1865 and he was 24. And then say, well, yes, indeed, here he is, 1865 to 24, he came from Egloffstein. Great. But you might be one of those large number of people who are going to say, well, sorry, they send you a little form letter that says, same thing again and again. Sorry, but he wasn't from Baden-Baden. As you must know, Baden-Baden was just a town, and Baden was the kingdom. And Baden was separate from Württemberg. Now it's Baden-Württemberg is one state in Germany. These are all states. A lot of them have kept their identity, but they're now just states within the Federal Republic of Germany. This is the Federal Republic. This is East Germany. Hesse. There were three parts to Hesse. There was Kurhesse, also known as Hesse-Kassel, also known as the electoral Hesse. That was the area up in here, for which the state archives was Marburg. This is the one that's put out the list on Katrina, Marburg is also in the process of going through all their immigration records. People had to apply for permission to leave. They've gone through these old archival sources and they've pulled out all the names on the computer. This is under Dr. Inge Auerbach doing this work, training all of her young archival assistants in using computer and archival sources with computers. As you probably saw back here, our computer is the future for us as genealogists. I believe they have finished the period 1840 to 1850. They're working on 1850 to 1860 for immigrants from Hesse-Kassel or Kurhesse. 1840 they started. And there were immigrants that came here before 1840. I know. I'm working on one right now. In 1832, there was a large bunch of people who came out of the northern regions up here. They were farmers and they bad harvests and so forth. 1830s, early 1830s, they came from the northern regions of Hanover and came here. There was also Hesse-Darmstadt. That was a little area that was down here. There was even a little division area, and then there was another portion up in here. Darmstadt is the state archives for Hesse-Darmstadt. Again, Darmstadt has a card file that has been put together by interested parties over the years, and they have the names. The one problem with Darmstadt is the card file survived. All the original archival sources were lost in the bombing of Darmstadt. So you have the card file, but it tells you where they were from. So so-and-so left Boyan or Buzek in Hesse-Darmstadt, and they still have the Zweitschriften or church book duplicates of those records going back to 1808. So once they know that it came from Buzek or Boyan, they haul out the church book duplicate and say, yes indeed, there he is, there's the birth record. So you've got him back to 1808, and then you go to the local parish, which has the records back to the beginnings of church records. There was also Hesse-Nassau, which was the area just west of Hesse-Darmstadt along the western borders of Kurhesse. The archives for that one is Wiesbaden State Archives. I don't believe their files are as complete as Hesse-Darmstadt and Hesse-Nassau and Kurhesse. They're working on it. I think as more Americans get involved, there's going to be more archives working on it. In Württemberg, you have Ludwigsburg, which is the state archives, and you have Stuttgart, which is the Hauptstaatsarchiv. Just as in Munich, you have the Hauptstaatsarchiv, the main state archives for all of Bavaria. In Stuttgart, you have the main state archives for all of Württemberg. Unfortunately, these people don't have card files to any great extent. There are a couple of private individuals in the area of Württemberg who have compiled their own files, but are only willing to tell you for a certain fee of anywhere between $100 and $300 to tell you the place of origin. And after that, you can do some research in the local town. Going back to Bavaria for a second, because I've done a lot of work in Bavaria. I'll be in Bavaria again in June. Remember that there are all these counties in Bavaria. There's Mittelfranken, Oberfranken, Unterpfalz, Oberpfalz, and Schwaben, Oberbayern, Niederbayern, all here just in Bavaria. Each one has its own church archives. Let's say we're talking of Catholics right now. Catholics were probably the majority in Bavaria. But in the north, there were an awful lot of Lutherans. Okay, the Lutherans aren't so bad. We have the state archives of the Evangelische Kirche in Nuremberg. But they have not collected all of the Lutheran records of Bavaria in that archives. They have a very, very tiny number. Most of them are still in the parishes. Catholics. Let's say it was Oberfranken. You have Bamberg as the archdiocesan archives for those records. Almost without exception, all of the Catholic records for that county have been shipped into Bamberg. So they're there, but you still need to know that it was Mittelzinn, or whatever the name of the village was, before they know which volume of records to go to. They don't have it all centralized on a computer for all the Catholics in middle class. Not all of the archdioceses are that way. Würzburg, for example, it is the archdiocese, but the records are still out in all the parishes. So that makes it a little more difficult if your ancestor came from that particular county. Regensburg is another one of the archives where the records have been brought together. That's for the Oberpfalz. That's in the roughly southeastern corner adjoining Austria. Let's see what other areas we have. We're up in here, Münster, Westfalen, Nordrhein-Westfalen. A large book has been published on immigrants from Westfalen, but Westfalen again was divided into different counties, and so the book that finally came out was for the county of Münster, and that has been indexed and will be, I believe, in the supplement that just came out from Gale Research. 10,000 names just from Münster. All right, Hanover. This one always gets me. The census says Hanover. The newspaper obituary that you hopefully turn to said Hanover. Prominent businessman in Baltimore whose ancestors include some of the Schneiderite family. His obituary, I expected to find a lengthy obituary and exact date of birth and everything. It said he came to Baltimore about 50 years ago from Hanover. Well, unfortunately, when they say Hanover, they don't mean this little city up here called Hanover. It's like Baden-Baden, right? It's not Baden-Baden, the city of Baden. It's Baden, this big area, all the way down to Freiburg, just to Switzerland. Hanover was this whole area across the north, the whole northern stretch of Germany. The Kingdom of Hanover, from which some of the royal blood in England. Yeah. If all you know is Hanover, good luck. Because if you don't know the village, or even the district, there is no centralization or much of anything. You write to the state archives in Hanover, we're sorry, we can't help you, we get too busy, there's no one here to write it. There are a few published sources. There was a man named Hans Marenholtz who published a few articles in Germany, and we have collected those articles and indexed them in PILI. He's gone through a few records, and he's found some immigration records, and he has put down a few names. Sometimes even the immigration record didn't say. 1832, 14 individuals left our town to go to America. You have to know the parish. Right, I've tried to touch on a lot of places. Now, of course, you realize if your ancestor came from Sachsen-Anhalt, or he came from Mecklenburg, he came from Brandenburg, or Sachsen-Gotha, Thüringen, all those places, that's all in East Germany. And obtaining material from East Germany is a matter of luck. You can write to a place, and there'll be somebody who might be able to do some research for you, and it's all around the bush. You're sending 2 cartons of cigarettes, and he'll do so much, or you pay his brother-in-law in California, and they'll do some research for you. But it's very touch and go. A few records did make it out after the war in the closet in Berlin. This is Berlin, by the way. You realize Berlin is surrounded by East Germany. I didn't realize that until I was stationed in Berlin, and then I realized I was surrounded by East Germany. Right there. Some records in the Geheimnisstaatsarchiv in Dahlem, which is a part of Berlin. And those have been filmed by the Mormons. And if you're lucky, maybe the parish where your ancestor came from is filmed, and you can just write to Salt Lake instead of writing to East Germany. There are other areas where people spoke German. Switzerland, we haven't touched on Switzerland at all. Lots of Swiss came to America. There's a book that was published here in this country, strangely enough, by a Swiss. He lives in Switzerland, but he had this book published in this country in Virginia, I believe. Norfolk, Virginia. It's called Swiss Genealogical Research by Paul Anton Nielsen. And he goes into, in general, the kinds of sources that are available for Switzerland. It's a whole separate chapter I can't touch on here. There were Germans who came from Bohemia. I'm working right now on a man who came from Nixdorf, the very northern edge, a little gut out here, came from Bohemia. He went and settled in Cologne, became very prominent as a maker of precision tools, and then came to Baltimore and made money. Okay, Bohemia, that's a whole other section, because the Germans, they went back, Prague was the capital of Bohemia, that's a whole other chapter. But a lot of Germans who came way over here, they came from the stretches now in Poland, maybe about that. Most of the records of Poland have been filmed by the Mormons. The problem with Poland is you have to identify the parish. I've worked on some families where they were German Polish, or they were Germans who lived in communities bordering with Polish communities. They lived sort of side by side. Came to Baltimore, they said the name of the town to the pastor. He wrote it down. You can't find that name anywhere on any atlas. I'm talking of 19th century German atlases, which were very thorough and supposed to have all the names. So that there's special difficulties that come up if you're talking about Poland. And those are regions like Westpreußen, Pommern, Posen, Danzig, Ostpreußen. Ostpreußen is now Russia, Soviet Union. Some of those records have also been filmed and got out, and those are in Salt Lake City. But, so those are the special problems we have with Polish, or now Polish areas, and with Russian, Soviet Union areas. Prussia. This is also one of my favorites, because it's as good as Hanover. I don't know, I have to count very slowly to myself when I find Prussia, because Prussia was, of course, it was originally a very small area. The Hohenzollerns were, let me see now, what it's called. Right. The ruling house in Prussia. The Hohenzollerns, okay. The Hohenzollerns had a little area of Prussia. They became very strong. They took over the rest, and it all became Prussia. Right? So you say Prussia. I'm working on one right now. This lady insists on every sense that she was from Prussia. The problem with that is that Prussia, because of various intermarriages and contracts and so forth, had little enclaves. Right there was a little enclave of Prussia, surrounded by Hesse. And over in here, there were little enclaves of Prussia. There's an area, I believe, it was not Bielefeld. Bielefeld. Something very odd. There was an area right over in here, west of the Rhine, that was also owned by Prussia. So anybody coming from that area said he was from Prussia. I had a case of that in the 18th century. Again, you had 20, 100 different areas. In the church record in York County, Pennsylvania, it says the person came from Baden, and yet the village is over here. Those little villages were called Badische Fürstentümer, and they belonged to Baden, way down here.
Is there any correlation between the last name of the person and the village that they lived in?
All right, you're going on. Ernst Tody, who lives in Ohio, has come up with what he considers a research help. Take the name of the person, the surname, and maybe by the ending or by the name itself, if you're lucky, you've got a name that's really off the wall. I mean, nobody would have had that name unless they came from such and such a place. Brugge, for example, is one of the few. There are only 3 or 4 Brugge families left in the world, as far as I know, and they're in Augsburg, Germany, Bavaria. There were certain terms. If your ancestor was named for a profession, and that was a name given to that profession only in a certain part of Germany, then that will maybe be a help. But don't forget that Germans moved around. There were Swabians that went to East Prussia. They couldn't get a job down in Swabia, which is the western portions of right here. Swabia is sort of an area that overlaps into Bavaria and Württemberg. And they ended up going to maybe the eastern provinces over Romania, first because they couldn't make it here, and they couldn't make it over there, so then they finally went to the New World. Or they went to East Prussia. So knowing the name of the character of the name may be some help but it may lead you into a lot of wild goose chases. Because there were people moving from this area over to this area down to this area. There were one ancestor I had flee from the French from Dexheim here on the Rhine, ended up over here in northern Bavaria, and that was in 1740. Not the 1800s where we're just expecting people to hop on the train. We're talking about on foot, all the way across central Germany.
Could you exclude sometimes with the name, like the name of first? Put that into different things, okay.
Okay, I've had that also. I had a man call me yesterday from Wilmington. And he was, all right. What happens is back in the Middle Ages and a little later, people began attaining surnames because maybe his son became a potter. So his son was Hans the Wurzbacher. That is Hans the man from Wurzbach, or eventually just Hans Wurzbacher. I studied a family last summer in Bavaria. He lived over here in Zelbitz in northern Bavaria. His name was Wurzbacher. The town of Wurzbach is up here in Thüringen, over in East Germany. I don't know if there'll ever be a way to tie in how the evolution of the name came about, because the Wurzbach was already showing up in Bavaria in the 14 and 1500s. And that's getting back to the point where even archival records are not going to play much. Before the beginning of church records, the church records begin with the Reformation. And my conjecture on that is everybody started keeping membership lists. You want to know who had the white hats and who had the black hats. Are you Lutheran or are you Reformed? Are you Catholic? Right? So the earliest church records you have date from around 1533. There were some Catholics who were keeping records out of curiosity, perhaps dating to late 1400s. But they're getting very imprecise about the information in those church records. Maybe just first name, no wives' names. The information gets very, the further back you go, the less information. Well, all right, that's if you tie into royalty or the upper echelons, there might be some printed history about the family or something like that. But what you get back to is before the church records of say 1500, 1533, you're dealing with old tax lists. You're dealing with lists which the royalty kept about all the farmers that they really sort of owned, the serfs, and so. Hans Schmidt paid me 30 shekels of grain for the farm that I led with use. And it's very difficult to go back from that point because you can only conjecture. You can say, well, let's see, Hans Schmidt and then Peter Schmidt owned it before he did, and then Rudolf Schmidt owned it before he did. I suppose that was father, son, father, son, but you better put question marks in those connections on your charts because they never a way that you'll prove it.
As concerns Prussia, isn't it also true that the border was rather elastic depending upon which war had just ended and which one had not yet begun for the period you're researching?
Sure. Borders changed. We found that out after World War II.
I know, but it happened earlier too, with all these Prussian wars.
Oh yeah, sure. Look at any map of Germany, say from the historical atlases. Germany in 1600, Germany in 1700. It's like watching a computer with all of the dots flashing on the screen and switching positions.
Have you looked at the map of Africa lately and compared it with one for 20 years ago?
That's an interesting thought. All right, each part of Germany, whether east or west, Prussia or Bavaria, has its own set of sources and its own calendar of research priorities. First and foremost is identification of village of origin, for which there are numerous sources on this side of the Atlantic before any inquiry should be sent overseas. If Americans would exhaust all possibilities here before riding over there, Germans would probably not be inundated with inquiries right now. With that thought, I will leave you and wish you a good day, and may fortuna smile on you in return your record. Your research. Want to take questions?
Yes, you can take care of that when you go.
How many states had the census in 1681? In Germany, how many states had a census? I believe the one that I got a copy of was 1681. Is that right? 71?
All right, there were certain areas which did keep censuses. Some of the censuses were no more than a counting of individuals and a summarizing of the numbers. This depends greatly on who was ruling at the time. There was no uniform policy anywhere until Bismarck. No uniform German-wide policy. It depended on whether the person in charge was the Duke of Baden or the whatever. And they took censuses occasionally. And the few censuses I've seen, I have not found much help. They're not like American censuses where you had so-and-so age 50 and son and daughter and everybody in the household. You know, I've seen. They were basically a way of keeping a record of who paid their taxes and who didn't. And I don't know if they cared that much about if they had a wife and 3 children.
Did you quote Daniel Root for some of the research that's done up in Pennsylvania, that country, in the growth book?
I know of Daniel Root's work.
The immigrants into the United States. You quoted Strasburger and Kransky.
Well, yes, I did that because I prefer to use Strasburg and Hinckley. I find them more thorough than Root. You'll find some names with slightly different spellings, and so forth. But if you want to go that route, just use PILI because Root and Strasburg and Hinckley are in both. I mean, they're both in.
But Rook has the Hudson Valley very early terms too, which are not in Strasbourg and Hinckley.
Yeah, but they are in PILI. All of the early middle books and all of those are in the other sources.
I don't speak German, but looking at a map of Germany, I see a lot of names of towns that end in B-A-C-H. Does that have any particular connotation as town, city, village, or something like that?
That means brook. Any village which originated by a stream of water. And a lot of the people who came to this country with that syllable in their name became Bau later on. Even Bach, just a simple Bach, the person became Bau, or Brumbach became Brumbau.
That's me.
Do you have any feeling of credibility of the heraldry that's done in Germany? We've wasted money, my family's wasted money on heraldry that traces us back to Charlemagne.
Well, forgive me for all of you out there who already have your coat of arms on the wall. Please forgive me. When people write to me asking how they're related to Charlemagne, as I said in the beginning of my speech, most of our ancestors were just simple, hardworking folk. And they're not related to royalty, I'm sorry. They probably didn't have a coat of arms. If anything, they might, if they belonged to a trade, they might have borne the seal of the guild, the crossed mallet or something like that. But that does not place them in the ranks of royalty.
Weren't there religious groups?
Oh, well, there was the Knights of the Templar, but I really don't think. That's the last thing I look for. That's the frosting on the cake. If somebody, once we've got all the family tree and we see how everybody fits in that village, fine. Then we'll start looking for maybe to see if they might have been related or had a coat of arms. But I have very few clients who they've become prominent. They're prominent in what you might call the Bürgerschichten, the middle classes. They become Olympic swimmers. They became prominent lawyers. They became big businessmen. That doesn't mean that they came from royalty. One? Okay. The area in northern Germany, the von usually meant it was just another way of naming a person. Instead of saying Wurzbacher, they said he was von that village. Of that village. And of course, as you get over into the areas closer to Holland, it became B.A.N. But that doesn't mean royalty either. It's merely a way of identifying that person to the local authorities. That was Hans van, that village. Rembrandt van Veen. Very possible. Yeah, but again, you probably will not get back to the point where that took place. It was back before our records go. And also, there's some very unusual naming practices up in northern Germany. I'll have to warn you about that. The men were taking the women's names, and they took the names of the estate they lived on, and then they switched it all around. They finally, the Prussia came down and said, no more of that. In about 1860, you start using names consistently. And so, down on that. Yes, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, if memory serves me correctly, that's here. That's right. I think that's also a district as well as a town. You might run into a little bit of a problem there.
One of the districts, I know the campus.
Yeah, okay, good. Then you have to identify the archives in time.
I'd like to ask you, we could probably call it much old type of place. When a ship passenger, you find the age of the passenger. You find an adult, hopefully a man, and you find a woman, then you find children. I've never seen the original list, but of the ages, and they all have these sort of names. Which is reasonable trajectory that is
I would have to go on that assumption unless proven otherwise. Yeah. What I would say if I had the village, I would write to the village and I would say, this is what shows the ship's list. I can't say that that's man, wife, and 3 children, but please give me data on those people. They'll look at the baptisms and they'll say, well, they weren't. This was actually brother and sister and 3 nephews of a family that died. And they brought them over to the village.
Another question similar to that. On the information on the record, it has a column at the very end that says lost address. And I think I read someplace that this can be misleading sometimes because, can you comment on that?
Yeah, case in point. We did a research of a favor for a distant relative by marriage for a family. And by tracing the family itself, I wasn't having much luck. Ship's list was misleading and everything seemed to be misleading. They consistently said they were from Braunschweig. This was a 19th century immigration. Braunschweig was a duchy east of Hanover, right in here. And there was also a couple of enclaves which belonged to Braunschweig. There was an enclave down here and then an enclave over here. There was a book published on immigration from Braunschweig for the period 1846 to 1871. That's also going to be indexed in PIR. Unfortunately, the people who did that book excluded those 2 enclaves. The people from these 2 enclaves, of course, were still from Braunschweig. All right, this was a big family that came to Baltimore. There were several. One of the uncle who probably was the first to come became very prominent as a cigar manufacturer. Several of his nephews followed. It's a very common pattern. Uncle made it good. Let's go and work with uncle. So a lot of nephews arrived, and the one branch that I was following wasn't taking anywhere. He died fairly early. His wife remarried. So I started tracing all of the other branches of people that settled in Baltimore. Found an obituary for in the German newspaper for this other branch. The place given was Stellenthal. This was very intriguing. The place given was Stellenthal. Couldn't find a Stellenthal on the map anywhere. I knew from writing to the archives in Braunschweig that they had a record of a certain man of that name, not the same man, but a certain person with the same surname, coming from a place called Hellenthal. Okay? So I'm thinking, let me see. In writing the obituary, they look in the old family Bible, and here's this word of origin in script, German script. So instead of ST, instead of an H, they see an ST. Right? I write to Hellenthal, there's the whole family, everybody. Except that the one generation, this particular branch, moved away. The father was in the lumber business, and he apparently had not been doing well there, and he moved all the way over to a place called Herleshausen over here on the border. So when apparently he died, and then his wife, his widow, and his children decided to try their luck in Baltimore. So the ship's list says Herleshausen. Well, if you wrote to Herleshausen, you probably wouldn't find much. If you tried for baptismal records, so forth. If anything, the only thing you'd find there would be one death record for Andreas Germann. All the rest of it is up in Herleshausen. So that's where last place of residence can be very misleading.
It's down before Helen Hall.
Oh. Well, let's see. What did I do in that case? The only Hellenthal that came into question that would have been a Braunschweig was that one. There's only one Hellenthal in Braunschweig.
If a name is the name of a town in Germany, going back to when people took surnames, were the people with the same surname of the same family or of the town?
Very good question. Yes, I would. Yes, the last part. They were the same town. They probably are not related. Okay, so all Wurzbachers were not related. They just happened to come out at the same time. So let's say, for example, that here's a nice little hamlet of Wurzbach, and say in 1351 there was a terrible plague. A few people who were remaining there probably thought in that period that it was God's vengeance on that town. They were not going to stay around. So several of them moved off and settled in this nice little place over here in Bavaria called Zelbitz. They were just all people who came from Wurzbach and settled in Zelbitz. Maybe not relatives. And there probably is not a way in the world that you could go
You only go so far back.
Right. They were just serfs.
Coming from Pennsylvania, I'd like to suggest a couple other sources. The Pennsylvania Folk Life magazine of the recent years have many excellent articles by archivists giving not only origins but about conditions under which they left.
Right.
And this applies to Western Maryland quite a bit. Then the other thing is, in Pennsylvania we have the tax lists at places like Gettysburg, York, and Lancaster. Well, they're very rare in Maryland, but if you want to find just when people arrived, and some of those tax lists also tell you what property they had, how many cows, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. How many acres? I'll tell you one thing about Pennsylvania records, though. You might find that it says they own 100 acres. You go and try and pin it down in the land record. A lot of what happened in Pennsylvania, people came in and they took out a warrant of survey for their property. Then they also had to patent that property, which meant buy it from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania at a certain price. I think it was 15 pounds per 100 acres. And unfortunately, many of our immigrant ancestors were not too clever as far as getting down to actually making the purchase. They didn't realize that you needed that final little patent paper in hand. And there were a few who were very clever, came along and said, "I'm sorry, but you never patented that. You may have lived on it 20 years, but you never patented it. I just patented it right out from under you."
But that gives you all the more records. That's an advantage of Pennsylvania too.
No, but you see, when they patented out from under them, then the man was not there. That's right. Well,
I have a deed of Kansas, and that's the county, and I'm not going to just where it was. So I wrote back there, and they said to me, "Well, we have a warrant survey, but they never did it. But I have the actual deed, so that they said."
yeah, there are all kinds of real headache problems there, like generations of unrecorded deeds. Yeah.
What this gentleman was saying about the tax records in Pennsylvania, I have not personally checked into it. I have worked with someone who owns this particular line. And in Huntington County, we found an individual we were interested in. They had a tax record. I was surprised when I heard this. For the years 1842 up to 1847, each year, they taxed him his occupation, his cow, his house. And I don't know how good those records were on Huntington County. I don't know.
There are some of those for many other counties. Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, has right in the Historical Society, Cumberland County. They were able to, before they were thrown away, they took all the old tax records and put them on a shelf, starting with 1850. What happened to the ones before that? Somerset also? Well, we were doing mostly our own. I'll take one more question, that's all.
What about travel today in East Germany?
That's something I'm investigating because I'd like to be able to take assignments to go into East Germany. I'm a little bit hesitant about it because I served in security service in the Air Force, and they might want to ask me a few questions. But I'm going to consider it and see if I can get a visa and do some work in East Germany one of these years. But I don't know of many people that have done that so far. You can travel in East Germany. Hopkins University is taking a group of 40 people over for the anniversary of Luther's birth in June or July. And they're going to visit. Most of their visits are going to be in East Germany, Wittenberg, and all the places that Luther was. Bach. And I suppose if you had ancestors in nearby town, you might say, well, do you mind if I leave the tour? Only if the policeman will accompany you. Well, thank you very much.
First of all, after hearing the speaker this morning, I don't know how well qualified we are to talk. We had quite a lot to say. We're glad to be here with you this afternoon and share a little with you what we have found and how we go about some of our work. And it must be nice to have all Lutheran and Reformed background when you have church records to work with. When you get into your Mennonite Anabaptist heritage, you have no church records up till, in our particular congregation, 1916, not that long ago. And there's a long story of persecution tied up with the Anabaptist heritage. And because of this, the Mennonites have chose to simply ignore keeping records because they could be gotten by the authorities of the government and used against them. So it's not, how would you say? It's not just neglected. I mean, it's neglected for a reason. I think that first we have a short slide series that we're going to present, and then Lois Ann will have some insights to share with you. I'm going to do a little changing around here and locate myself back there.
Someone know how to turn the lights off?
Now, can everyone hear me? Okay, if you can't, you'll have to let me know. First of all, this collection of slides is taken from a slide lecture given by Jan Gleitstein, named Faith of Our Forefathers. Jan is the art director at the Mennonite Publishing House in Scottsdale, Pennsylvania. And the other slides that are, some of the others are taken by Lois Ann and myself, so we were here from 78 and 80. Before we can understand the heritage we know as Anabaptism, we must have a little knowledge of a boat. Never had this problem before. It wants to change without me touching it. To have a little knowledge of it. Political system during the Middle Ages. Here we find two very powerful organizations, the church and the state. In practically all cases, the churches were controlled by the state and were inseparable. The church was known as the state church, and all residents in a certain political territory were subject to the state church. These churches were very wealthy and at times very corrupt. Pictured here is the Rosemont Church. If you have traveled into Europe, I'm sure you've noticed the large, beautiful churches known as gross monsters, or cathedrals, erected in the old section of most all the large cities. They're genuine architectural beauties and are symbols of the church's wealth. And you have also noticed the large castles perched on the tops of mountains, overlooking grand valleys and rivers, also of great architectural beauty, both inside and out. These were the homes of the nobles and the wealthy in the land, and are symbols of the state's wealth. The church and the state oftentimes work together, calling for the so-called holy wars, in which the poor citizens of the land were called to do valiant deeds and lay down their lives for God and country. To finance the architectural dreams of the church and the conquering winds of the state took incredible sums of money. The state got their money through taxation, at times rather severely, and the church by way of selling indulgences. An indulgence, pictured here, was a slip of paper purchased from a few foreign monks in order to gain forgiveness of sins. It was during this time the printing press was invented, and with it the printing of the Bible, which enabled those with money to read the Holy Scriptures for themselves. Up until this time, knowledge of what's contained in the Bible was limited to the priesthood, who only revealed certain portions of the Scripture, and mostly to their advantage. The Anabaptist Movement was born in the country of Switzerland, in the city and canton of Zurich, which is indicated by the blue and white coat of arms at the top of Lake Zurich in northern Switzerland. Indicated right there. The story begins in the gross monster. This large cathedral was ordered built by Emperor Charlemagne about the year 800 AD. It was, as were all churches at that time, a Catholic church. But in 1522, the canton and city of Zurich declared themselves to be a Protestant region, and they appointed to the ministry of the Grossmeister a priest named Ulrich Zwingli, who was to become one of the leading reformers. This is Charlemagne. Zwingli, here a statue of Zwingli, was a devout student of the Bible, and he recognized the corrupt condition of the state church. In an endeavor to improve upon this condition, he conducted a Bible study among a number of intellectual students in his parish. The movement caught on quite well, and Zwingli was impressed with its momentum. When he realized the movement was becoming, in his opinion, radical, he tried to slow it down somewhat. When this failed, he turned his back on the movement. At this point, two of the students, Conrad Grebel, a university student from Paris, now a resident at Zurich, and Felix Mons, the illegitimate son of a priest, carried on his work. As the movement grew, the authorities of the church and the town council of Zurich became concerned that this movement would weaken their political system. So in January 1525, the officials of the church and the town council met and outlawed the Anabaptist movement. Issues at this time were separation of church and state and infant baptism. This decision by the authorities could have been the end of the movement, but instead we now recognize this event as being the final push of the organizing of the Anabaptists, who were later known as Mennonites. During the next 10 days, the Anabaptists, as their enemies called them, were given the opportunity to give up their services and to rejoin the state church, or to disband their business and get out of the country. I'm sure some did. But there was a small group of believers continued their efforts because they believed their views to be right. Several days later, this handful of believers gathered together in a secret prayer meeting, which we know as the birth of the Anabaptist Movement. In this meeting, they baptized one another, basing their actions on the teachings of Christ. The movement consisted of about 15 to 20 people in January of 1525. By Easter of that same year, it had grown to about 40 members. And within a year, their number had reached approximately 4,000 throughout Switzerland. And from there it grew rapidly over Europe. Some people said it spread like wildfire, but the Anabaptists were not free to meet anywhere. So they had to meet at many different kinds of secret hiding places. One of these known hiding places is a cave, the Teufelhole, or the Cave of the Anabaptists, located in the mountains east of Zurich, not far from the village of Baltimore. The cave is a 20-minute trek up a steep sloping meadow, and then a short walk into the woods. Here they would meet, with a lesser chance of being discovered by the authorities. And now I'm going to move you to Holland. In 1530, there was a similar movement in Holland. And there the church met with the same faith. They had to worship in a secret meeting place. This is the single Mennonite church in Amsterdam. It is located behind these three, what looks like three buildings, but it's actually a disguise. And this is what's behind those three buildings. An auditorium that would seat 2,000 people. In northern Holland, Friesland, where the movement began, this is another hidden church. It's a smaller. The parishioners would go through the door where the lady is standing, and in the back of that house is a small auditorium. The minister obviously spoke from the pulpit, and as you'll notice around the walls, there's a raised bench or a pew. This is where the men sat, and it was their job to keep a watch out the windows to watch for the authorities coming to arrest them. The women and the children sat in the lower part. And what's a trip to Holland without windmills and tulip? And pretty costumes. And of course a ball of Holland Dutch cheese. Many steps were taken to squash the movement, the Anabaptist movement. Your property was confiscated. You were banished from the country quite often. You were branded. You were beaten, tortured, and thrown into prison. This is the castle at Troxelwald in Mennonite, Switzerland. And in this castle, there was a prison tower, pictured here, where quite a number of Anabaptists were imprisoned. Benedict Brachfeld was one of the Mennonite immigrants that spent some time here. This is what the best cell looks like. That was on the top of the tower. And pictured here is the cells that were in the bottom. I didn't have a flash along this, so I couldn't take pictures inside the cells. But in there was stocks where I'm told men were kept in those for as long as 9 months. There was a cell on either side here and a furnace between the two, so they did have some warmth. After 2 years, more drastic measures were begun. It was on January the 5th of 1527 when Felix Mons, because of his beliefs, was tied up at this spot by the authorities and thrown over the side of a small fishing boat into the Lamont River, which runs through the heart of Zurich. Just before he was pushed overboard, the onlooking crowd which gathered to witness the event heard Mons sing, "Into thy hands, Father, I commit my spirit." Mons was the first of the Anabaptist martyrs. In spite of the increased persecution, the Anabaptist movement was still spreading like wildfire. Now it is beginning to follow the rivers and trade routes of Central Europe. To most of us, the Alps are a place of great beauty that remind us of God's creation. But to the early Anabaptists, these Alps, these high mountains, were barriers between certain death at home and freedom, which was obviously somewhere else. So when we look at these mountains and think of a plighted Anabaptist, it's not hard to imagine a family leaving their mountainous home. A father, a mother, with several children, perhaps a horse, with very little money and just enough food, traveling by night through these mountains, mostly by night, being very careful not to be caught by the Teufelsjäger or the Anabaptist hunters. In time, the movement spread northeast to the shores of the Baltic Sea and eventually to Danzig. It reached far east as Moravia and north into much of South Germany. Notice how the Anabaptist movement has spread out of Switzerland and is now spreading out of Holland in all directions. The Rhineland territory was influenced by both the northern and the southern Anabaptists. The main focus of Mennonite history along the Rhine River was in the Palatinate, or in Europe the area is called the Pfalz. General rolling countryside. In the Palatinate we find several Mennonite communities that are Mennonite today. This picture was taken in Varholt, and this is the home of Michael Preble, or Preble. And here is the Hosterhof, which is near to Varholt. And this is the place where the Hostetler family came to from Switzerland, and then eventually went on to the colony. Other names of the Varhof would be Showalter, Horst, Hostler. This is the Hunter Legalhof, located in the Breitgau, which is part of the Rhine Valley. At this place lived the Hers, the Kendics, and the Milan. And the Oberregelhof, about 2 miles from the Unterhof. And then the Landis family from here. In the Palatinate we find 2 distinct types of Anabaptist history. The first being that Anabaptist movement which began to the south in Switzerland in 1525, and the second, that of the Mennonites, which began in Holland in 1530. Eventually, Eventually, these two groups were both known as Mennonites, taking their names from Mennonite, pictured here, the leader of the Anabaptist Movement in Holland. This early movement in the Palatinate was almost completely eradicated by a order of vicious edicts issued by Emperor Maximilian against the Anabaptists. Pictured here is one of the copies of the edict. When there were not enough printed edicts to go around, all the villages, the local sheriffs and bailiffs were ordered to copy these documents once more. By hand, so that there would not be a single person in the empire who wouldn't know how to go about reporting these, quote, damned Anabaptists who continued to spread their damned opinions. As a result of these edicts, many of the Anabaptists and their families were marched off to jail. It was not until about 1815 that Anabaptists were tolerated. At this time, the Mennonite farmers had a pretty good life, but they were still forced to buy exemptions to stay out of the army. You would have to make a basic agreement with the government regarding the cost of an exemption. Then once a year, you would have to go to authorities where they would stitch a small payment certificate that you had paid your annual exemption. This was done each year, and your military obligations spread out over many years. So you can imagine what happened to a farmer with 8 sons, having to pay fantastic fees to keep his 8 sons out of the army. They went broke buying exemptions. Even though they were successful farmers, they were simply forced to leave the country. And the journey across the ocean in small crowded sailing ships was not exactly a trip to look forward to. In the late 17th century, they began to overflow into the New World. At the invitation of William Penn, to come to Pennsylvania where they could worship God as they felt the Holy Scriptures dictated, without being molested by the authorities of the government. It was in October of 1683 when the first Mennonite refugees set foot on American soil. They settled near Philadelphia at Germantown, which is today part of Philadelphia. This settlement is known as the first permanent Mennonite settlement in North America. There were Mennonites in America before this time. Around the year 1707, the German settlers built themselves a log meeting house. When this became inadequate, they replaced it with a stone structure in 1770. This meeting house is still in use today, and it is the oldest Mennonite meeting house on the North American continent. One of the leaders of the Mennonite fellowship in Germantown was William Rittenhouse. He built a house on Paper Mill Creek, and on this creek he built a paper mill, the first one in the American colonies. It produced paper for the Germantown printer, Christopher Sauer, and others. Because of flash floods, the mill washed out twice. The first time, William Penn's son helped to rebuild it, and also financed the rebuild. The second time it washed out, it was not rebuilt. Today, a historical marker commemorates the fact that William Rittenhouse, a Mennonite migrant and a minister of the Germantown congregation, was America's first paper maker. When the Germantown settlement became too crowded, the later arrivals continued on to settle in other places. First along the Skippack Creek, pictured here in the Franconia area of Bucks and Montgomery County, and later along the Tecklenburg Creek in the east eastern and southern portions of Lancaster County. Some of their original homes are still standing. Here we see the house of Beelman Hall, pioneer bishop in the Franconia area. He was instrumental in having the Martyr's Mirror translated from the Holland Dutch and printed in German for use among the colonial Mennonites. Another important early migrant was Christopher Knox, a pioneer school teacher, who in the 1700s taught the children of the Mennonite settlers in the towns of Skipack and Franconia. Many other notable 18th century immigrants could be mentioned, but time does not permit. In the early half of the 19th century, a new wave of migration begun. Pictured here in this early woodcut engraving are Anabaptists in the 1820s leaving Europe to make a new home in the New World. Many of these migrants settled in Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Ontario. Their reason for coming was to escape the militarism, economic distress, and political unrest caused by Napoleon and his wars. From these days date the passports which we find in so many Mennonite family attics, such as this one issued by King Ludwig II to Jacob Bender. Also in those attics, pieces of silver